The Open Boat by Stephen Crane. The following presentation is going to provide a summarical overview of the story The Open Boat by the writer Stephen Crane. And towards the end of the presentation, uh, we will observe a concise analysis of The Open Boat. So let's begin. Stephen Crane, the author of The Open Boat, um, he was a writer who um, actually left the university. He left Syracuse in order to become a reporter. And, he's also the writer of books like The Red Badge of Courage, another very notable book, notable story. And he's certainly given a lot of credit for his description of war instances. Now, in relevance to The Open Boat, the story we're about to observe, he acquired I guess as a reporter, the company he was working for offered him a writing job to um, to travel to Cuba as a war correspondent. Now, on his way to Cuba, um, he was the steamship that he was traveling on. It wound up sinking, and thus he he and other members um, saved themselves by boarding a dinghy, which is like a safety boat. And he underwent this experience for the span of 30 hours. And this is what we're going to observe. We're going to observe his fictionalized overview. I should say partly fictionalized because it's certainly influenced by his own experiences of indeed the sinking of the Commodore, the steamship, the Commodore, and his ordeals in traveling on this dinghy. So it's interesting. I mean, the nice thing is that we're getting a even though it's a work of fiction, it's also not a work of fiction, right? So we're getting like a realist account. So, like the writer um, Anton Chekhov, Stephen Crane um, is also illustrating a sense of realist literature, right? Now, one unique take of Stephen Crane's writing is something we'll talk about in the analysis as well, is that his realist approach is it may also be referred to as naturalism. This is the idea that humans are, confronting nature, right? And the burdens of confronting of nature, sometimes fatally, sometimes without any sense of accomplishment, right? So let's begin. Let's. One other detail I'd like to point out is how sad such a prolific writer, and he only got to live 28 years old. Unfortunately for him, he died of tuberculosis, but at 28, he was already such a prolific writer, and I just think how sad, the ironies also of nature, the way in which we're um, the message that I guess in a sense true to heart in representative of Stephen Crane's own life, the message that the story is also about to give us. So let's observe. Let's observe. So, as mentioned previously, this story is influenced by the actual sinking of a ship called the SS Commodore. As Crane is traveling as a war correspondent to Cuba, and as the Commodore is sinking, him and three other gentlemen, they board a dinghy safety boat, um, so that for obvious reasons they don't drown alongside with the Commodore. So who boards the Dingy, the safety boat, alongside the correspondent? Well, it's a cook, and as we'll look in the story, he's he's somebody who's certain of optimism, yet he also has a sense of dependency, right? You know, his optimism de- depends to a certain extent on the efforts of others, and not particularly his own efforts. In the story, he's often asked to empty the boat of water, right? And that seems to be his primary function. uh, the second um, individual who boards the boat, the Dingy, is a very hardworking individual. You know, very does a great deal of the rowing, probably more so than any of the other characters. And his name's the Oiler. Now, interestingly, the Oiler is the only character who has a name. He goes by the name of Billy. He's very independent. You know, very feels like he can provide the resolution in and of himself. So he's a really notable character, right? With a lot of authority. Uh, the third character, boarding the Dingy, uh, is the correspondent, you know, the reporter. Now, the correspondent, a lot would say, is parallel to Crane himself. Now, this correspondent, he's also a notable figure in the story, and he's somebody who's very skeptical. He's skeptical in his, you know, of course, he's what does a correspondent do? Well, this correspondent observes and he expresses or observes and he writes, right? Well, he's observing. What is there to observe? Well, they're out in the ocean, so he's observing the he's observing the weight of nature upon them, and he's very skeptical. He's not like the cook. The cook is certainly very optimistic. The correspondent is very skeptical. He's very doubtful of a positive outcome. He's also existential, meaning he's pondering a sense of purpose of this happening to him and to his fellow boatsmen, shipsmates, if you will. So this is the third gentleman on the Dingy, and the last is none other than the captain. Certainly representative of an authority, right? He's a truthful entity, and he's truthful in this sense. He's truthful in the sense that he's not idealistic or necessarily optimistic like the cook, you know, and being overtly hopeful that a good is going to result. He's truthful of his outlook, and he says, look, these are the possibilities of what's going to happen, even if they're dismal, even if they're dismal and negative and not so positive. Um, but he's an authority nonetheless, and so he carries about these these realities. Um, More than anything, he's certainly that authority figure, and he's got a hurt. I believe it's a hurt arm, hand, right? He can't really row the boat, so to speak. Um, so so these are the four figures that we're going to observe in the scope of the following story. So um, Crane divides the open boat into 7 sections. Really interesting. And let's observe these sections. Section one. Section one, you know, begins with a description of you know the realization that these men are out at sea, and the way he describes their ordeal is that the boat is having to um, um, overcome the clash of these waves, right? The ocean that seems to be about, you know, the insight that it's about to devour them. Um, so imagine, you know, here you are on this Dingy, and you've got the massiveness of the ocean hovering about you. Right? I mean, it's certainly a scary thought. This first section also, as the story carries out, relates a description of the cook. I believe, is having a conversation, and with the oiler, I believe. Also, some of the other characters that they're on the boat and they see the shore, and they see this house of sorts, right? And of course, the cook is very optimistic, and so um, the cook refers to it as a house of refuge. And he's countered, one of the other characters, I believe it's the owner, or the correspondent rather, who says, "Look, it could be a life-saving. There's the only ones that have a crew is a life-saving station. There's a little bit of a debate going on back and forth whether it's a house of refuge or a life-saving station." Right? And the oiler says, "Well, cut it out, guys. We're not there yet. Let's not get our hopes up, so to speak." And that's basically it. I mean, it's a description of what they're facing out at sea, and the sense of possible hopefulness between this possible house of refuge slash uh, um, um, life-saving station. The second section, continues about with the overview of the difficulty of the facing the waves, and the the captain points out, "Look, do you see that light over there? Um, that there's this lighthouse, possible lighthouse over there on the horizon." And so again, it very very similar and parallel to the first section of the ordeals of the ocean, and the sight of this gleam of light about. The third section, and so this third station, the not station, third section, um, it begins describing um, the bond between the foreman on the Dingy, and regards this, I guess in the ordeal of the struggle, regards it as a brotherhood of men. Um, and there's also mention, they're in a dinghy, they don't have a sail, but one of the men says, "Look, maybe we can create a sail with our coats." And so they go about, making the attempt to have a somewhat of a working sail, and they're partially successful in the matter. Um, Also interesting in this section is the discovery of cigarettes. One of the gentlemen, points out that he has 4 cigarettes that have been, I guess, muddled with water, but there's also 4 very dry cigarettes. Um, Symbolically, the inferential um, application here in the matter is that um, amidst the struggles of the ocean, one reality is, that one's efforts to be successful against this monster of nature. Well, it's unbeatable. You can't defeat nature, right? It's in vain. But then there's the other of there's the other sense, in a dialectical sense. There's the sense of possibility, and that yes, with work and effort, the 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 efforts may indeed pay off, right? Okay. Fourth section. So the fourth section, they're still referring to the shore, right? And they comment that look, there's this lighthouse, but they don't see us. What's going on? Funny, they don't see us. And for the first time, what's interesting in this section is they there's commentary on the possibility that they may not make it. So they address addresses, and, instructions for the loved one if whoever gets to survive. But even more emphatic in this section is the mention of this quotation that we're going to witness about 3 times, and the quotation is as follows: "If I am going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, why, in the name of the 7 mad gods who rule the sea, was I allowed to come thus far and contemplate sand and trees?" Very poetic, right? Very poetic in the writing. So we're going to witness this throughout the rest of the story about 2 more times. Um, and so the one addressing this quotation is the correspondent, and we'll talk about this in the analysis section. Um, there's also mention of a critique on this matter of fate. Now, fate is somewhat of a theme that's addressed in the open boat, and that in one sense, you have man's will. But the question arises that does man have control of his or her life? And I guess when you're facing nature, it kind of seems to be that no, you don't. Man doesn't have control over nature. It's in a sense your fate that this is what's going to come about whether you like it or not, right? But there's still that sense of denial, right? That sense of skepticism, so to speak. And so the one echoing this measure seems to be the correspondent. So there's that hopefulness to arrive at a destination, right, for safety. And one of the men says, is that St. Augustine? The captain says, very truthful. Remember, the captain is very straightforward, very truthful. No, it's too near Mosquito Inlet. And then they finally they discover that on the shore that they're observing, there's a man there, and look, he's going up to the house there. And so the man notices them, and so he starts waving, and he starts waving and waving, and then so the man said, "Awesome, we're finally going to be rescued." But it seems to be it still seems to be the hopefulness is like repetitive. They see this man, he's waving, but nothing's being acted upon. Nothing's happening. Well, again, there's that sense of hopefulness. There's those 4 dry cigars, those 4 crisp, perfectly fine cigars, and then it's circular. It comes back, and there's that sense of doubt. If I am going to be drowned, it's the second time we hear this quote. If I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, why, in the name of the 7 mad gods who rule the sea, was I allowed to come this far and contemplate sand and trees? It's really interesting. 5th section. So 5th section, the shading of the day starts changing. It's getting dark, and I guess with the changing of the light, you see the changing of the color. And Crane points out the variation in colors of how nature gives us that variation of colors, as if to apply 2 possibilities. There's that doom, or there's that sense of hopeful possibility. So there's a description of there's probably more than any of the characters, although they all to a certain extent, maybe with the exception of the captain, they all row, right? And so here the oiler plied the oars until his head dropped forward, and the overpowering sleep blinded him. And he wrote yet afterward. And so the poor oiler's, he's just rowing and rowing, rowing. He tells the correspondent, he says, "Will you spell for me a little?" He asks meekly, "Will you help me out a little bit?" So there goes the correspondent. Same thing, correspondent's very helpful as well. And he too rose, and he looked down at the two men sleeping underfoot. The cook's arm was around the oiler's shoulders, a grotesque rendering of the old Babes in the Wood. Babes in the Woods. So there's constant rowing, constant effort. Section 6. And again, there's that skeptical sense of doubt dealing with nature, right? Dealing with the burdens of nature, so to speak. If I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, why in the name of the 7 mad gods who rule the sea was I allowed to come this far and contemplate sand and trees? It's really interesting. So then, there's this constancy of rowing, and the Oilers pointed out certainly as a name, Billy, and he's asked by the correspondent, "Hey, will you help me?" Of course, the Oiler is that constant, enduring laborer who's not going to let up, and he says, "Sure." But there's that display of effort, and then he tires out too. So then he winds up saying, "Hey, will you spell me? Help me out now." And so the correspondent says, "Sure, Billy." So we see the efforts, right? And it's almost like that repetitiveness, that hope and effort, but then that sense of skepticism, right? Section 6. And here, as we're approaching near the end of the story, it's kind of like a telling theme of Crane. It's like Crane's almost giving us the truth of his story. He says, "All right, look, here's the boat. It's going towards the beach." Yet the correspondent wondered if none ever ascended the tall wind tower. This tower was a giant standing with its back to the plight of the ants. It represented to a degree, to the correspondent, the serenity of nature against the struggles of the individual. Nature in the wind and nature in the vision of men. She did not seem cruel to him then, nor beneficent, nor dangerous, nor wise. But she was indifferent, flatly indifferent. Nature doesn't care. Right? It's like Crane is saying, nature simply doesn't care. Nature's not gonna. Nature doesn't purposefully go out and set about to do you harm, but neither does nature go out and set about to do you good. It's just the truthful sense of the reality of nature. Right? This is the cards one is dealt. How do you deal with the truthfulness of nature? You deal with the sense of fate. So, but see the existential message coming here. What's the purpose of all this? And it's as if Crane is saying, it's pointing out his observations of nature, saying, there is no purpose. Get over it. There is no purpose. It is what it is. Shamefully and unfortunately. So then there's a sense of hope. They're getting closer to the shore, and the captain says, "Okay, guys, look, we're approaching the shore. Just note that as we get closer, that it's going to get tougher. The waves are going to clash a little bit stronger, and we're going to sink. let's do as much work as possible. Just be sure that when the boat is sinking, you guys get out of there and start swimming for the beach. So, sure enough, the boat starts sinking. They leave the boat, they start swimming, um, and they're heading about, right? And the movement pushes them towards the shore. They pass near to the shore. The oiler, the cook, the captain, and following them went the water jar, bouncing gaily over the seas. So they're almost there, and what happens? In the low water, face down, lay the oiler. His forehead touched sand that was sometimes between each wave above the sea. I mean, what a sad. Here's the drowning of the oiler, hardest working man on the ship. You'd figure that if anybody's going to make it, it would be the oiler, the laborer of it all. And so it's like this crushing defeat, right? But in the sense of this crushing defeat is also partial victory. Partial, of course, because not all of them made it. It says, the welcome of the land to men from the sea was warm and generous. So the rest of them do make it. But a still and dripping shape was carried slowly up the beach. Here's the oiler. And the land's welcome for it could only be the different and sinister hospitality of the grave. When it came night, the white waves paced to and fro in the moonlight, and the wind brought the sound of the great sea's voice to the men on the shore, and they felt that they could be interpreters. So, what's the sense of all this? The correspondent keeps saying, I don't get it. What's my purpose here on this ocean? What's the meaning of it all? And so, they don't get it, but it's not until they get to the shore that they said, okay, now I hear the voice of nature, and so now I can express to you that, hey, I understand now. Now we understand this issue of nature. Nature doesn't care. It is what it is. Right? Man will not overcome nature. Right? Okay. So let's talk about a couple of things. Right? A brief, very concise analysis, but let's talk about a couple of things. So, the scope of the story is this struggle of humans against the behemoth of nature. Existentially, let's ask: does nature want to hurt us? Does nature want to help us? Neither, right? And this deals with the theme of or the critical approach of naturalism. It's this idea of a realist writing. This idea of realist writing is called naturalism, of man facing nature in vain. When has man ever defeated nature? It's impossible. It's indifferent. It doesn't care. Right? And so this leads us to this idea that, hey, if we face nature, that is your fate. You are, however you negotiate your dealings with nature, that's going to be your fate. Your will to overcome nature, I'm sorry to tell you it ain't going to happen. Right? I mean, I'm speaking like one of the boatsmen, right? It ain't going to happen, right? But it's not going to happen. And so I think this is the primary message that Crane seems to be associating in this these storytelling attributes that confronting nature is it's going to depend on not that you're going to overcome nature, but maybe you can go through some ordeals to be able to survive the difficulties of the burdens that nature provides with humans' confrontation of it. And so, if you consider and think about Crane's own, sad ending to his own life, died of tuberculosis. Um, it's kind of he's wearing that same coat. He did burden this experience, 30 hours out in the ocean. Um, but sadly and more fatally, he also burdened an ordeal with tuberculosis. And I mean, such a promising writer um, dies at 28 years old. And there it is. There's nature overcoming humans, right? So I hope this helps you. I hope this gives you an insight into this very, very interesting realist story, um, and and that it provides a reflective message for you. Thank you.